We begin life medias res. We are thrown into a particular culture in a particular historical context. Our culture identifies itself partly relative to the relations and rivalries it has had with other cultures. And we, as children, don't know the full story. We don't know why we have various culturally conditioned practices. And ultimately, no one alive today knows the full backstory of why we do things the way we do them. A lot of things are just kind of tradition. And the rationale, the original reason why we do a lot of things is lost. At the level of intellectual history, we inherit a lot of concepts that we can't justify. In fact, in order to critically analyze culturally conditioned concepts, you first have to just take them and use them, because that's how you learn language. Before you can start to question what is physical matter or what is the soul or any of these things, you first have to take the naive sense of them as they appear to you in your upbringing in order to orient yourself in the conceptual space and begin to define the conceptual space. It's only with maturity that you can start to use these concepts kind of against one another in order to question their underlying assumptions. And at a deeper level than culture, we have instincts and intuitions of value that we take for granted. The second you're born, immediately you have an appetite. You want milk. And you're not going to, as an infant, stop and think like, why do I want this? Of course, it's to stay alive, but take that same logic far enough and, people do question, like, is it really worth it? Hamlet, to be or not to be. The Buddha says life is suffering, and the goal is to escape the wheel of samsara. In Hinduism, the same applies. In Platonism, the same sort of thing seems to apply. The world of generation corrupts us. Our appetites distract us from what is truly real. So it is possible to have that kind of view of most of our instincts. Just because you want a thing doesn't mean that it's good for you. And with more knowledge, we could discover that what we initially start off thinking is good is not good. A lot of people want to have sex. A lot of people want a family. But is that ultimately good for us? Many people have an aversion to questioning that sort of thing. Especially people like with a very political orientation. They want like a certain nationalist form of policy that promotes, their group, people that look like them. But like, why does it matter to you that after you die, more people that look like you are still around? Now, personally, I think it does matter, but there are metaphysical justifications, moral justifications that I think need to be given in order to, be satisfied with affirming that ethically. I couldn't just affirm ethically or morally something that I felt at a gut level but didn't have a reason to support. Like, I think when you put something forward, you should have a reason for what you're saying and not just like, this is what I feel. I assert that like the existence of my people matters. Because not everybody agrees. And like in the modern day, almost a majority of white people think the existence of white people doesn't matter. So, it is possible to move beyond those basic instincts. And unless you engage in the kind of philosophical self-criticism, self-reflection on these culturally inherited norms and intuitively given aesthetics and values, then like you won't be able to kind of move beyond that basic thrust of like, this is what I want. And it's kind of childish to say like, this is what I think is good without having any explanation. Like, I think you need an explanation. But at a deeper level than those things, we have intuitions about what space is, what physical bodies are. You know, for most people, what is real is simply what presents itself in phenomenal awareness. Like, matter is impenetrable, extended body through space. It's what like inhibits our motion. And physical theories about quarks and gluons or whatever, like they just don't register for a lot of people. They don't matter for a lot of people. And that's pragmatic, you know, in terms of the cost-benefit analysis. It's generally better to go with these evolved heuristics. It's generally better to go with culturally conditioned notions. Questioning them has a cost. But again, the same sort of thing happens where if you just take for granted the way things seem to you, like the nature of time, you just believe in time in a naive sense, then you can't explain why you ought to be doing what you're doing. Like maybe the Buddhists are right, maybe the Hindus are right, Plato was right, and we ought to be escaping this world of generation. If you take time for granted, you take our evolutionary conditioning for granted, our values evolutionarily for granted, like you could be wrong, you know, and not that you can't be wrong if you philosophically analyze all of that. But especially this notion of time, I think people don't think very deeply about. Time seems to have a greater form of reality than space in a certain way, where most of space is outer space and gas clouds and stars and stuff like that. But time imposes itself on us. Time is the space of moral deliberation, and we have to make decisions that have consequences inexorably. You know, the reality of time is harder to question than the reality of the moon. You know, a lot of people these days question whether the moon is real. But these same people don't know what it would look like to question the reality of time. So, you know, one way of thinking of this is in terms of the story of time that most people have in their minds who are materialists. You know, time began somehow around 14 billion years ago, and things gradually evolved in this one-directional flow of time. You know, the time was really passing. You know, 14 billion years ago, the reality period that was, you know, a state of like plasma, electrons and, you know, hydrogen gradually beginning to form with more time. And right now, 14 billion years later, the real is the current state of the universe. And those past states are no longer real. You know, that's how things seem to us. And going far enough forward in time, we have, you know, the heat death of the universe and everything dies from entropy. And that's it. That's this bizarre story of a cosmos that comes into being from nothing, evolves for countless aeons, and then dies to be replaced by nothing whatsoever. Like from nothing to nothing. And this is like a blip in cosmic eternity that has no rhyme or reason or explanation. And that's what most people are actually living with in terms of their model of the world, which is like, of course people are nihilistic. Of course people embrace hedonism because there's no ultimate meaning in that. Also, it doesn't even make sense. Like, how did something arise from nothing? You can say that something arose from quantum foam, you know, some kind of substrate reality, statistical dynamics that, given like a long enough time, would kind of spontaneously give rise to a singularity or whatever. But that's not nothing. You know, there's a big difference between some kind of quantum foam substrate an actual nothing. So, even when the physicists talk about it, the universe doesn't come from nothing. It comes from whatever generates singularities. And also, like, the question, is this the only Big Bang event at all? We wouldn't know experientially whether there were infinitely many Big Bang events and we're just in one of them, or if there was just one. So I don't think this picture of time is all that helpful. If we can call that physical time, though. Maybe that's a coherent idea, that there is this large-scale evolution of the cosmos, and that's what's extrapolated if you take current physical laws and kind of run them back far enough on a time scale, back and forward far enough. It's the implications of the laws of physics extended through time, away from the present. But what if reincarnation is true? What if, when you die, you pass into some other life, in some other time? Maybe it's not purely consecutive. You don't necessarily die in 2023, God forbid, and then be born later on in 2023. Maybe you die in 2023 and you're born in 5000 BC. Or maybe you're, born in 7000 AD. If that was the reality, if you moved to random spots on the timeline, or if there were branching timelines, we don't need to posit this one connected temporal series of events, like one four-dimensional block time, and we move to various locations in it. Maybe it's a block time multiverse, and when we die, we can go to any other spot on the multiverse. Well, in terms of the structure of that multiverse, the physical structure of the multiverse time, we could say the past and future is one thing, but relative to our soul time, the cycle of our reincarnations, time is a very different thing. And of course, if that was true, if you reincarnated into different points in time, that would be the real time in an ultimate sense for you. Right now, I'm at this point. In my future, I may move to the past of physical time or to the far future. And yet for me, it's not the far future, it's what's immediately next in order for me. So I don't think we should take physical time too seriously. I don't think we should absolutize it and say, this is the world. It's not. That's what happens if you extrapolate the current experience of the world that we see using our current physical models. You can extrapolate that backwards in the time metric of our physical theories, and you get the Big Bang. Extrapolate it forward, and you get the heat death. But if that soul time is real, then the real time that actually matters may never go all the way back to a Big Bang or never go all the way forward to a heat death. It might be that the center is always characterized by a state of entropy similar to our own, and there's always the capacity for projecting backwards this Big Bang and heat death on opposite extremes, because anthropically, entropy, the structure of entropy is necessary for the working of memory, right? And we perceive the series of moments we do because of the structure of human memory and the ability to recall and narrow down various events because of the kind of irreversibility of certain temporal processes necessitated by entropy and by the laws of quantum mechanics. So, perhaps that is the reality. Perhaps time is more eternal than we think. We haven't been around for 14 billion years. And when we think of past human civilizations, is it that humanity first attained a civilized status, 12,000 years ago, or 8,000 years ago or 6,000 years ago, depending on your historical theory and your criteria for, what constitutes civilization in the first place. Is that it? Or, is humanity more eternal than we think? If this multiverse block time is real, there might be countless worlds that resemble the Earth and countless civilizations through untold ages. So according to the soul time, you could have a past of reincarnations that go back to civilizations that existed effectively on Earth 1,000,000 years ago, 10 million years ago, 1 billion years ago. And then some of the crazy time scales from Hinduism don't necessarily seem that ridiculous. Now, is that reincarnation process possible? It's a good question. First, I think we should look at temporal A theory, B theory, and C theory, just to kind of frame this in a more standard philosophical sense, and also kind of introduce temporal D theory, which is how reincarnation might function. So temporal A theory is the kind of naive idea that the present has a privileged metaphysical status. It is really real. The past is not really real. The future is not really real. There's some metaphysical, ontological distinction about the present. Of course, what that is left unspecified in most naive accounts of temporal A theory. And even philosophically justified accounts generally don't really give this the weight that it deserves. It's important to note that if temporal B theory, a basic kind of block time theory, were true, then you would always seem to inhabit a special present because that's where you are. But it's the same as being in a really big room and you're actually in one spot and you notice all the details around you and this spot seems very real. My immediate experience seems very real. It doesn't mean the rest of the room doesn't exist. Just because you feel connected to the present moment in a special way doesn't mean that the rest of time doesn't exist. An anthropic explanation for the kind of special status of the present moment works perfectly well. There's no problem in saying what is special about the present is that's where I am, as opposed to saying what's special about the present is that's what really is, period. That's a big distinction, but most people don't really grasp that distinction. So unless a temporal atheist has an explanation for this metaphysical privileging of the present, there's no particular reason why we should accept A theory. Phenomenologically, A theory is indistinguishable from B theory. They would be experientially the same. But there are extra things to explain in the A theory. Why did time start at a particular point? Why and how does the present truly transform? There are a lot of problems that arise. B theory is the standard block time model, and that holds that there is an objective ordering of temporal moments and there's an objective cardinality. There's a real past and a real future in the block time. But there isn't an ongoing and real process of transformation from past to future. That's not built into the structure of reality. Instead, that occurs anthropically. Just like a book can exist, it has a real beginning, a real end, a real sequence of all the pages, and we read through it depending on where we open the book to. So if reality is this block time, we are simply reading through a particular moment, and we could go to any variety of moments. Temporal C theory, McTaggart came up with I think he devised actually this whole scheme, A theory, B theory, and C theory. So he goes beyond B theory, saying that the cardinality of the B series of time is derived from the A series. So we think there's an objective beginning and objective end of time in the B series because there's an objective before and after due to the transformation of time in the A series. But if that real transformation of the present moment is illusory, then the reality of the cardinality of the movement of past to future, like that, there's an objective earlier and objective later in the block time, that doesn't work. That's McTaggart's argument. Of course, I think there are other ways of coming up with an explanation of, why something is earlier or why something is later than simply the A series is true. But in any case, the C series, which McTaggart lands on, says that there is an objective ordering of temporal moments, like moment B is before, or rather is between moments A and C. You can say certain moments are at a particular location relative to other moments, but you can't say that this one direction is earlier and that one direction is later. Just like if you're in a big room, you can't say one direction is objectively forward and one direction is objectively backward. Forward and backward is depending on your orientation and your movement through the system, not on, the system itself. So C theory rejects the cardinality of time, but preserves the ordinality of time. Now, technically, I would be a temporal D theorist because I don't believe that the ordinality of time is exhaustive and infinitely specified. So I do believe in a many worlds block time. I've talked about that before, and that's kind of a separate topic to some extent, but let's just take that as a premise in what I'm going to say about D theory. So with this many worlds block time, there is an ordinal ranking given a particular temporal identity. Like if I'm identity M, temporal moment M, N-O, through T may be fully specified. It is entailed in the identity of M that it has access to this given set of futures. And these particular set of moments are truly future to M. And likewise in the past, like up to like G, H, I, J, K, whatever, is specified relative to moment M. But going back further, there isn't an exact specification. The reason I go for that is that if there were a full specification of every subsequent moment and every past moment relative to M, then that would be infinite information. Whenever you specify a relation, that's like a bit of information that you're bringing into existence. And we know that there is conservation of information as well as mass energy. And at a deep level, information seems to be the same as mass and energy. So if a given identity had fully specified relations to everything in the block time multiverse, then each moment, each point in the block time would be infinitely massive because it would contain infinite information. Now, you can get around this by saying that some external thing registers all of those relations. But then you're kind of positing an omniscient mind outside of the block time that keeps track of all of the relations. And it has to do more than that, because if you just kind of take the laws of physics and run them infinitely, with the known laws of physics, don't apply any special constraint to them, then any given moment of time, any finite identity, is consistent with a range of possible values. Personally, I think that's why quantum mechanical phenomena exist. That's why the probability wave seems to exist. Because one moment doesn't fully specify all of its possible contextual moments. Like a finite structure in an infinite world has infinitely many contexts it might fit into, just like a position on the chessboard has a range of games that it could fit into. One move on the chessboard doesn't specify all future moves, and it certainly doesn't specify all past moves. In one particular game, the past is known because we have a memory of it. But the chessboard itself, like the game of chess itself, without a log of the moves, put a position on the board, and you can define an infinite range of past games that may have been consistent with this given position. So we're in a given position with the information that we contain as an integrated identity, and that defines a causal repertoire, as it's put in integrated information theory. So once you get that, then given the multiverse, and given the fact that there's always a range of futures and a range of pasts, you can draw a continuity of experience basically ad infinitum through the block time multiverse. And that would look like this reincarnating in various places. It would always have to be locally continuous. The local ordinality would have to be consistent with the laws of physics, such that, like, you know, the structure of memory is intelligible, the physical structure of the brain is intelligible. The local ordinality has to be limited by the laws of physics. But there isn't like an infinitely specified location of each moment in the block time multiverse. Rather, it's that any point in the block time multiverse has a cloud of contexts that are consistent with it. I think that's in keeping with the spirit of modern physics. I think it actually does work. And you can watch my argument for the mind's immortality video, where I give this argument more explicitly for, some form of post-death continuity of experience, whether that's reincarnation or not. In a certain sense, like, all forms of afterlife are just some form of reincarnation, you know, like, unless you want to say that you become totally disembodied and like you occupy the realm of forms or whatever. And that's like, you know, not reincarnation, samsara, but nirvana. So the Eastern systems already have an account of this. Advaita Vedanta accounts for that. But anyway, if you want to say that like we arise from the dead when Christ returns, you know, the resurrection of the dead, that's sort of just reincarnation. Like reincarnation, literally speaking, is what's happening there. So like however you want to conceive of the afterlife, if you have a body in that afterlife, that's reincarnation, kind of just in the most basic sense. That's what's going on. So that's the sense in which I believe in reincarnation, not any specific logic of it that I'm committing myself to. But in any case, if that reincarnation is real, then soul time is much more important than like physical time. Physical time is just what happens when you extrapolate our physical models way backwards and way forwards in the time dimension. It doesn't mean that that's what's really real. That's what our physics models. But we aren't necessarily confined to this one space-time dimension, a single four-dimensional block time forever. Maybe the structure of space and time interweaves in ways that we aren't used to thinking about. And I think this is just a very foreign area for people conceptually. Time seems imminently real, and so we grant that same reality to the time that physics imagines. But so another point here is that it's not simply that a given point in the block time, a given soul, let's say, defines its causal repertoire fully locally. Because in order for that ordinal sequence to be coherent, the possibility of recovering information that isn't immediately given would have to be there. I'll give an example to make this more concrete. So say you're in, again, some big room, and there's a two-way mirror. There's a scientist on the other side of the mirror. You don't know he's out there. But you're in this room, and you have your own series of events that you go through. You don't see everything happening in the room. You only see what you're looking at. But there is the scientist on the other side of that glass, and he sees everything that you are not looking at in the room. So if that sequence of pasts and futures were totally locally defined, completely, then what was real and ordinally determined and fixed and not like in a kind of cloud superposition would only be what you were looking at immediately, and everything else would be totally like in that kind of quantum superposition state. And that would have some weird consequences. I don't think that's how it works, because there is the possibility, because the scientist is there, of inquiring of the scientist the nature of the rest of those events. And so that narrows down the probability spectrum of everything else that's happening enormously. Now, I think that applies in our actual experience, because I don't think we're the highest intelligence out there. I think there are many levels above where we are. And I think there are intelligences that have access not only to a single kind of space-time dimension and with the flow of time we're used to, but see things at a kind of pan-dimensional scale. And that's like the scientist on the other side of the glass. If these intelligences are there, and ultimately one greatest intelligence that subsumes all the rest, as is posited in Hoffman's theory as well, Donald Hoffman, if that's the case, then there is like the possibility of recovering information from that highest level intelligence. If we can make contact with it, it could inform us in principle about the location of all these other things. Just like, what collapses in decoherence in quantum mechanics seems to extend well beyond what you're consciously observing at any point in time. That's because it's not your present conscious observation that limits the scope and defines the causal repertoire. Instead, it's what you have causal access to. So it's what you could in principle recover that collapses the wave function, not what you happen to immediately be perceiving. So, if you can recover information down the line from that total omniscience, then the worlds that you're passing through, the continuity of events around you, have to be coherent at the macro scale as well as the micro scale. Now, from the perspective of that pan-dimensional intelligence, from God's perspective, it may well be that there are still a range of like continuous timelines that you are consistent with, but it would narrow it down quite considerably. So that's kind of the subtlety in this. But, you can imagine that God would be able to entertain the branching timeline scenario. And when you get to him on one timeline, like, he would know all possible turns you may have taken. And to distinguish what's actual and what's potential among all those possible paths would, again, require this kind of metaphysical specification of what is more real about the actual and what's less real. You almost have to just give to God this, like, ability to make certain things actual and others merely potential, and it's his decision, ultimately arbitrarily, because we don't have any logic for why certain things end up being actual, other than teleology. But then you have the Euthyphro dilemma, and like, okay, does God decide what's actually for the best? So these are the sorts of problems that arise if you want God to distinguish real actuality from real potentiality. I mean, it's certainly possible, but I would think that for something to be truly possible, it has to actualize somewhere. That's Aristotle's definition of possibility. So I don't believe that God would see possible worlds that aren't actual, which means the implication is that any given moment in a timeline is really actually relative to a variety of possible contexts. But that those contexts aren't purely locally defined. They are defined relative to the requirement that these this causal repertoire fits into a coherent cosmic picture. There needs to be one cosmos that fits together as a whole that your experience would make sense in light of. Like, there are a lot of models of the world that you could come up with that are consistent with your immediate present experience, but which are not consistent with like a coherent entirety of the life of the cosmos, if you know what I mean. Like you could posit the cause of your sense awareness in aleatory events that flit in and out of existence. You could posit your experience being caused by, any number of, supernatural causes, but that would not fit into a total coherent cosmic picture. And so you'd rule out all of those explanations of your current experience. So that's why, like, it's not that you yourself define everything relative to your own soul. That would be like you fully create your reality. You are Purusha projecting Prakriti, and that's it. It's rather that it's a cooperative endeavor between your soul, which is kind of projecting the world and measuring time, and the world soul above it that projects and measures the eternity, perpetuity of time together. So there has to be that correspondence and coherence between your own will and the will of the cosmic mind. And beyond that, there has to be a coherence with supra-cosmic intelligence, Plato's realm of forms and the intellects that inhabit it. So those intellects would also have to like constrain what is real and possible. And forms of teleological constraint may be involved at that level as well. Now, that's what I have to say about my philosophy of time. I've talked about some of this before. I thought it might be helpful to go over it again. I know that at this point, I've probably lost just about everybody. But, if you want to discuss this philosophy, I think it matters. It may not be 100% evident why, but yeah, I think we have this basic notion of time in an inherited way. We don't question it all that much. And, when we begin to question it, things can immediately start to seem very foreign and unreal because we connect what is real to what is like present in a meaningful sense. But is that ontologically the case? Is that the real, or is that only our reality? So if you want to seek the really real, you have to question those concepts of what is real to you. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Yep, a lot of this is also consistent with Platonism. I didn't really get into the connection there. And actually, there are more dimensions of this that I didn't address. But as I said, maybe that's better left for personal conversations and, dialogues. So thank you guys for listening. Feel free to reach out to discuss this stuff. This is the kind of stuff I like thinking about and talking about. So God bless everybody. Thank you for listening.